I knew something had shifted the moment I stepped onto the porch. The late afternoon sun slanted across the boards, showing every scratch, every uneven nail I'd hammered in myself over the decades. It used to feel like an embrace, the quiet welcome of a house that had grown old with me. But now it felt watched. The front door stood ajar, just enough for the faint smell of fresh paint to reach me. It wasn't the kind I used. This was sharp, chemical, impatient. Inside, the hallway was brighter than it should have been. The warm, honey-colored walls I'd chosen 20 years ago were gone, replaced with a sterile, cool gray. My grandson, Ethan, stood at the far end, holding a roller and grinning like a schoolboy caught in the act. "Surprise, Grandma," he said, as if I'd been waiting for this. "We thought the place could use a little modernizing." The word landed heavier than it should. From behind him, a woman's voice, light, but already carrying the weight of decision. "It's going to feel so much more open, so much fresher." Blair, his wife. I walked further in, my footsteps echoing against the newly bare floor. The old rug was gone. The coat rack too. The photographs that had lined the hall for years. My husband's smile, Ethan's first steps, vanished. In their place, nothing but the echo of walls that had been stripped too clean. "When did you start this?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "This morning," Ethan said quickly. "We wanted it to be a surprise before you got back from your trip." 3 days away visiting an old friend. That was all it had taken. Claire's eyes flicked toward a stack of boxes in the corner. "My boxes," labeled in my handwriting. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We thought we'd store some of your things in the garage. Just to give the place more space." Always more space. I ran my hand along the cool new wall, its dampness clinging to my fingertips. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But the quiet inside me had begun to shift, an old familiar tide turning back toward itself. Because this was still my house. And they had forgotten that. By the next week, the changes had begun to multiply. It started small, so small that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. The blue teapot my husband and I found at a flea market in 1974 was gone from its usual place on the kitchen shelf. In its place sat a sleek, white ceramic kettle that looked like it had never known a stove. "Do you know where my teapot went?" asked Ethan one morning. He glanced up from his phone, already half smiling. "Oh yeah, Claire put it in storage. Said the color didn't really match the new look." The new look. A phrase that seemed to follow me from room to room like a draft I couldn't block. The next day my armchair, the one with the frayed arms and the dent in the cushion shaped exactly to me, was missing from the living room. A pale gray couch now sat in its place, all sharp edges and stiff upholstery. "We donated it," Claire said when I asked. "It was really worn, Grandma. We'll get you something better." Better. Their word, not mine. Each day another piece disappeared. The quilt I'd sewn during the winter after my husband died. The heavy oak side table that had stood beside our bed for 40 years. Even the small tin of lavender sachets I kept in my dresser drawers was misplaced during what Claire called a deep clean. The house began to feel hollow, like a museum curated by strangers. My life reduced to boxes stacked in the garage, their corners gathering dust. One evening, I opened the linen closet and found the shelves rearranged, my embroidered towels shoved to the back, replaced by neat stacks of pale beige ones still stiff with packaging folds. I touched the rough edge of my oldest towel, the one embroidered with my initials, and closed the door quietly. I didn't say anything to them that night. But in the silence of my bedroom I began to count, not just the things I'd lost this week, but the years I'd spent filling this house. The hours. The sacrifices. And for the first time I wondered, not if they'd take more, but how far they thought they could go. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the air felt heavy before rain. I found Ethan in the living room, hunched over his laptop. The sharp glow from the screen lit his face in a way that made him look older, more closed. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Ethan, can we talk?" He didn't look up right away. "Sure, Grandma. What's up?" I walked in slowly, the carpet cooler under my feet where the new couch had left a shadow on the floor. I've noticed some of my things are gone. And I'd like to understand why decisions are being made without me. He exhaled, closing his laptop. It's not like that. We're just making some changes. For everyone's comfort. Everyone's comfort. It was said like a final answer, as though comfort were something that could be divided equally between us like slices of cake. My comfort hasn't been asked about, I said quietly. He shifted in his seat, rubbing the back of his neck. I know, but you've had the house the same way for years. Claire and I wanted to feel open, updated, fresh. We're thinking about the future here. The future, I repeated, the word dry in my mouth. Whose future, Ethan? His eyes flicked away, toward the kitchen where Claire was moving around, the sound of cupboard doors closing just a little too firmly. Our future, he said at last. All of us. But the way he said it made me realize I wasn't included in that picture. Not really. I stood there for a few seconds longer, the quiet between us stretching into something uncomfortable. Then I turned and went to my room, closing the door behind me. In the stillness, I could hear them talking in low voices down the hall. Not words I could make out, just the tone. That mix of planning and impatience. It was the first time I felt the truth taking shape. They weren't rearranging the house. They were rearranging me. Claire's presence was everywhere now, even when she wasn't in the room. I would wake early, hoping to have the kitchen to myself, only to find the counters already scrubbed to a sterile shine and my teacup replaced with a thick white mug I didn't recognize. If I reached for the sugar jar, it wasn't there. It had been relocated to a cabinet too high for me to reach without a stool. Things flow better this way, Claire would say when I asked. Always with a smile that closed before it reached her eyes. The living room no longer smelled of lavender and old books. A diffuser now hummed in the corner, releasing a thin mist of eucalyptus that made the air feel sharp and cold. My books had been moved upstairs for better storage, leaving the shelves to display potted plants and coffee table books with gilded covers. One afternoon, I came in from the garden to find her standing in the hallway with a tape measure, marking the wall where my grandmother's mirror used to hang. The mirror was gone, of course, wrapped in a blanket in the garage. What are you planning to put there? I asked. Oh, just something lighter. A canvas print maybe, she replied, her tone airy but firm, like a decorator speaking to a client. Client. That's how I felt, like I was paying for a service I never asked for. The small changes were no longer small. They were everywhere, layered on top of each other until my own home felt like a stage set for a play I hadn't been invited to join. One evening, I overheard her in the dining room on the phone. Yes, we've already started making the place our own, she said. By the time spring comes, it'll be exactly how we want it. Not once did she say my name. I stood in the darkened hallway, my hand resting on the banister worn smooth by decades of my touch. In that moment, I realized something with a clarity that startled me. Claire didn't see herself as a guest in my home. She saw me as the guest. The garden had always been my refuge. Even when the house was full of noise. Holiday dinners, Ethan's friends running through the halls, Claire's music bleeding from the upstairs speakers, the garden held its quiet. It was where I spoke to my husband long after he was gone, where I bent to touch the earth and felt steadied. That morning, I carried my basket of pruning shears and gloves out to the yard, already imagining the small tasks I'd tend to, deadheading the roses, checking the hydrangeas for new buds. But as soon as I stepped onto the grass, I stopped. The row of rose bushes along the south fence, 20 years of patient tending, was gone. Not pruned, not trimmed. In their place, a narrow strip of freshly turned soil. The air felt strange, too open, as if a wall had been torn down in my chest. Claire appeared from the side of the house, wearing her workout clothes and carrying a cup of iced coffee. Oh, you saw, she said brightly, as if unveiling a surprise. We thought this whole area would be perfect for a little patio, somewhere to entertain. Ethan's already looked at stone samples. We? Asked my voice low. She took a sip from her cup, unbothered. The roses were, well, they were kind of dated. And honestly, they took up a lot of space. This way, it'll be more functional. I walked past her without answering, kneeling beside the raw earth. The soil was still damp from the roots they had ripped out. My glove slipped slightly as I touched it, and for a moment I imagined the blooms, red, cream, blush pink, just as they had been last summer, swaying in the evening light. I thought of the mornings I'd spent out here in my robe, coffee in hand, dew clinging to my slippers. How my grandson, at 6 years old, had once run barefoot between these bushes, his laughter scattering the birds. And now nothing. I stood and brushed the dirt from my knees. Claire was still talking, something about outdoor furniture and a fire pit. I didn't hear her, because in that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about paint colors and furniture. This was about erasing me root by root. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt restless, creaking in places it never had before, as though it knew something was being undone within its walls. I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and let my mind drift backward. I saw the house as it had been the day we bought it. Faded paint, sagging porch, a yard overgrown with weeds. My husband and I had stood in the doorway, holding hands, seeing not what it was but what it could become. We painted the walls ourselves, choosing warm tones that caught the afternoon sun. We planted the garden together, each bush and tree chosen with care. Every corner of the house held a story. The dent in the hallway wall from when Ethan ran his first toy car too fast, the scorch mark in the kitchen from my first attempt at creme brulee, the patch of floor in the living room worn smooth where my husband liked to stand and watch the rain. I remembered the winters, how we'd gather around the fireplace with blankets piled high, snow tapping against the windows. The summers, Ethan's birthdays in the backyard, tables lined with lemonade and homemade pies, the roses blooming in their pride. It wasn't just a house. It was decades of my hands, my choices, my care. And now, in the space of weeks, it was slipping from me, not through neglect or disaster, but through quiet, deliberate replacement. I thought about the garage, stacked with boxes labeled in my handwriting. I pictured Claire's neat, narrow pen scratching new words over mine. Somewhere in my chest, a slow heaviness began to turn into something sharper. Not anger exactly, but a kind of steady refusal, because no matter what they thought, this was still my home. And I wasn't done deciding what would happen to it. After the roses, I stopped moving through the house on autopilot. Instead, I began to look. Not obviously, just enough to let my eyes linger where they never had before. On stacks of mail left open on the counter. On folders half tucked into the desk drawer. On the glow of Claire's laptop screen when she left it unattended for a moment too long. One afternoon, I passed the dining room and saw Ethan hunched over a set of papers. The word estimate was printed in bold at the top. Below it, a company name I didn't recognize. Something about stonework and outdoor design. I stepped in casually. "What's that?" He slid the papers into a folder before answering. "Just some ideas we've been throwing around. Nothing final." The folder disappeared into his bag before I could see more. Later that week, while putting laundry away in the linen closet, I found a business card tucked between two folded sheets. A realtor's name, a smiling photo, and the words specializing in historic properties. It sat in my palm for a long moment before I slipped it into my pocket. The conversations changed too. In the evenings, I'd hear them in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone to bed. Voices lowered, a mix of excitement and calculation. We'd have so much more room if, once the paperwork is sorted. By summer we could. Their words were like threads I couldn't quite pull together into a full picture, but I knew enough. The garden was only the beginning. One night I passed the study and saw a printed floor plan on the desk. The rooms were labeled differently than they were now. My bedroom wasn't marked at all. I closed the door quietly and went back to my own room. In the darkness, I pressed my hand against the wall beside my bed, feeling the cool, solid weight of it. Let them think I was slow to notice. Let them think I was easy to move. I was watching now, and I wouldn't forget a single thing I saw. It was a cool Saturday morning when I saw Margaret from next door standing by the fence, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her cardigan. She'd lived here almost as long as I had. We'd traded recipes, garden cuttings, and neighborly news for over 30 years. I hadn't planned to speak with her, just wanted a breath of air, but when she caught my eye, her face shifted like she'd been holding something she wasn't sure she should say. "Morning," I called, my voice carrying over the damp grass. She nodded, but it was a slow, hesitant thing. "Morning, dear. Haven't seen you out here much lately." I walked closer, leaning against the fence. "They've been making changes." Her eyes flicked toward the house, then back to me. "Yes, I've noticed." The silence stretched between us. Margaret wasn't a gossip, not exactly, but she had a way of letting truth slip out in small, heavy pieces. Finally she sighed. "I wasn't going to say anything, but I think you should know." She glanced toward the kitchen window, as if checking who might be listening. "I saw Ethan and Claire with a realtor in the driveway 2 weeks ago. They didn't see me." She was showing them listings on her phone, and they were laughing about what they'd do with the place once it was theirs. My grip on the fence tightened. "Listings?" Margaret nodded slowly. She said something about how the bones are good but the layout's wasted on an older style. "And Ethan? He mentioned knocking down your bedroom wall to make some kind of open loft." The words settled in me like cold stones. "I thought maybe they were just daydreaming," she went on softer now. "But then I saw Claire at the post office last week. She was mailing something to a law office downtown. Had one of those big, flat envelopes. When she left, I asked the clerk if it was property paperwork, and he just looked uncomfortable and changed the subject." I stared at the damp earth beneath my feet, the smell of wet grass curling up around us. Margaret reached over the fence and touched my arm, her fingers cool but steady. "I didn't want to interfere, but I've known you too long to let you be blindsided. Just be careful." I nodded, but I didn't trust myself to speak yet. We stood there a moment longer, the quiet between us filled only by the soft rustle of leaves. Then she pulled her cardigan tighter around her and headed back toward her porch. I remained by the fence, my eyes on the house. From this distance, it still looked like mine, the same porch I'd painted, the same roof I'd fought to have repaired before a storm could ruin it. But now I saw it differently. It was a prize, a thing to be claimed. And in their minds, I was already gone. I went inside, shutting the back door quietly behind me. In the kitchen, the counters gleamed under the cold light, smelling faintly of bleach. I stood there for a long time, my hands resting on the edge of the sink, until the faint sting in my eyes passed. Then I made tea. Strong. I knew now. I knew exactly what they were planning. And I also knew I wasn't going to let them finish it. That night, the house felt hollow in a way I had never known. It wasn't the quiet. I'd lived alone in this place before. It was the kind of emptiness that comes when you realize the walls around you have been quietly claimed by someone else's dreams. I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights upstairs went out. The clock ticked against the silence, steady and indifferent. My tea had gone cold hours ago, but I kept the cup in my hands, letting its weight anchor me. I thought of what Margaret had said. Of Claire's laughter in the driveway with the realtor. Of Ethan's easy talk about the future, as though my years here were just a preface to their story. And then my mind went further back. To the years when every paycheck was divided into 2 neat stacks. One for the bills, the other for this house. To the nights when I sanded and painted alone because hiring help was too expensive. To the morning my husband died and I came out to the garden because I couldn't bear to be anywhere else. This place wasn't just where I lived. It was proof that I had built something solid in a world where so much slips away. And they thought they could take it while I was still breathing. I pushed the cup aside and opened the drawer where I kept the old leather folder, cracked at the corners, soft from years of handling. Inside were the documents no one thought I still had. The original deed, repair receipts, the insurance papers. Every signature, every date. I ran my finger down the ink of my husband's handwriting, faded but unshakable. For years, I'd told myself that family came first. That sacrifices made for them would circle back to me in kindness, respect, care. But tonight, in the still air of my kitchen, I understood something I should have learned long ago. Love without respect isn't family. It's a slow theft. Upstairs, a door creaked open and closed again. Footsteps moved down the hall, paused, and then retreated. I stayed still, my papers spread out before me like a map. By the time the house was silent again, the decision had settled in me. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. I would not fight for a place in their plans. I would make my own. They could keep their new walls, their empty shelves, their future. But the house was still mine. And I would decide what happened to it. I stacked the papers neatly, tied the folder shut, and carried it to my room. When I lay down, I didn't toss or turn. For the first time in weeks, I slept straight through the night. On Monday morning, I left the house before either of them woke. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but it kept me sharp, alert. I walked past the driveway without looking at their cars, my leather folder tucked firmly under my arm. I didn't drive. I took the bus downtown, blending into the quiet crowd of commuters, most of them too busy with their screens to notice an older woman in a gray coat. That was how I wanted it, unseen. The law office was on the third floor of a narrow building between a jeweler and a tailor. The brass letters on the door were slightly dulled, but the name was still clear. Daniel Harper, attorney at law. I'd known Daniel for decades. He had been my husband's colleague once, back when our lives were smaller but steadier. He looked surprised when I stepped into his office, but the surprise quickly gave way to something warmer. "It's been too long," he said, motioning me to a chair. "What can I do for you?" I placed the folder on his desk. "I need to make sure my house stays mine," I said. My voice was calm, but there was no softness in it. He didn't interrupt while I spoke. I told him everything, about the renovations I hadn't agreed to, the missing furniture, the garden, the realtor, even Margaret's warning. When I finished, he opened the folder and began sorting through the papers. "You've kept everything," he said, almost impressed. "This will help. What can we do?" I asked. "First," he said, "we'll file a protective claim on the property. That will prevent any sale or transfer without your written consent. We'll also review your will and trust arrangements to ensure there's no hidden authority they can use against you." "Do they have power of attorney?" "No," I said. "And they never will." He nodded. "Good. We'll also prepare a notice to file with the county. It won't be public enough to tip them off right away, but it will lock the door behind you, so to speak." I felt a slow warmth spread in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but something like the first edge of safety. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I assume you don't want them to know you've taken these steps?" "Exactly," I said. "They think I'm quiet. I intend to keep it that way until I'm ready." He smiled faintly. "Then we'll be quiet together." When I left the office, the sky had cleared. The cold was still there, but it felt different now. Less like something to brace against, more like something I could walk straight through. On the bus ride home, I sat by the window and watched the streets pass. I wondered if they were awake yet, moving through the house, rearranging something else I hadn't agreed to. Let them. They didn't know the ground under their feet had already begun to shift. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was coming back from the market, the handles of my cloth bag biting into my fingers, when I saw Ethan's car turning into the driveway. Claire was in the passenger seat, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. They both looked surprised to see me walking toward the house. I smiled faintly, as though I'd been caught in some harmless secret. "You're out early," Ethan said, getting out of the car. "I needed tea," I replied. "And bread. The market still bakes it the old way." Claire's eyes flicked to the bag in my hand, then back to my face. "We were just talking about you," she said lightly. "We have a few more ideas for the renovations, if you're open to them." I nodded, letting my expression stay warm but unreadable. "Of course. Whatever you think is best for the house." The words seemed to please her. She slipped her arm through Ethan's and smiled, wide enough to hide the glint in her eyes, but not from me. They began describing their plans as we walked inside. A new patio where the garden had been. Knocking down the wall between the dining room and the kitchen. "It'll be so much brighter," Claire said, her voice full of certainty. I listened, setting my bag on the counter, pretending to imagine it as they spoke. But in my mind I was back in Daniel Harper's office, hearing his steady voice confirm that the property was now locked, the papers filed, the authority solely mine. Claire opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of glossy brochures. "We even found a designer who can help us bring it all together. We'll just need to finalize some paperwork once we've decided." I smiled as I reached for my tea canister. "Paperwork takes time," I said mildly. "No rush." She nodded, but her fingers drummed against the brochures. I could see it in her, the urge to move quickly, to claim what she thought was already hers. Let her hurry. Let her dream. Because the truth was simple. Every step she thought she was taking forward was into a space I had already cleared out from under her feet. That night, I made my tea slowly, breathing in the familiar scent of jasmine. From upstairs came the low hum of their voices, muffled by the walls. I didn't try to hear the words. I already knew their plan. And they would never see mine coming. It was early morning when I left. The street was still half asleep, the air cool with the faintest hint of rain. My suitcase stood by the door, packed with only what I wanted to take. Not what I could salvage, not what they would allow, but what I chose. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Ethan and Claire were still in bed, dreaming of renovations they would never make. The sale had closed 3 days ago. Daniel had called to confirm. Cash buyer, discreet transaction, no listing that could tip them off. The funds were already in an account they couldn't touch. The locks would change by noon. I left my key on the kitchen counter, beside the teacup I always used. I had washed it, dried it, and set it just so, as if it were waiting for me to come back. But I knew I wouldn't. On the dining table, I placed an envelope addressed to Ethan. Inside, a single sheet. "The house is no longer mine. And it was never yours." No anger. No explanation. Just the truth. I walked through each room one last time. The walls were still that cool gray Claire loved. The shelves still held her books and her plants. But to me it was already hollow, a stage stripped of meaning. At the front door I paused, resting my hand on the frame. I didn't feel grief. I didn't feel victory either. Just a deep, steady quiet, like standing on the shore after the tide has gone out. When I stepped outside, Margaret was on her porch, holding a mug of coffee. She raised her hand in a small wave. No questions in her eyes, just understanding. I wheeled my suitcase down the walk, the sound of its wheels clicking over the uneven pavement. Behind me, the house stood still, waiting for them to wake. By the time they came downstairs, I would be gone. By the time they reached for their keys, they would find them useless. By the time they called my name, they would realize they'd been speaking to someone who had already left. Long before this morning. The rain began as I turned the corner, soft and fine. I didn't rush. Each step felt lighter, freer, as though the weight of the house had been left behind with the key on the counter. I didn't know exactly where I was going. But I knew this. I would never again live in a place where I had to fight to belong.